the ongoing war. And it's quite clear that President Trump is deeply committed to ending this war. And he especially is interested in opening the Strait of Hormuz. But I would argue that if you look at what's happened in recent months, his situation has gone from bad to worse. And ending the war is going to be very difficult for him to do. And the deal that he is likely to get moving forward would be worse than any deal he could have gotten in the past. But before I get into the nitty-gritty of what's going on today, I'd just like to talk a little bit about sort of the history of negotiations between Iran and the United States going back to the Obama administration. As I'm sure most viewers remember, President Obama in 2015 got a nuclear agreement with the Iranians. It's the famous JCPOA. And that 2015 agreement did allow Iran to enrich uranium, but it is unequivocally clear that there was no way under that agreement that Iran could get a nuclear weapon. President Trump got elected in 2016, and in 2017 he moved into the White House. And remember, the agreement, the JCPOA agreement, was in 2015. In the summer of 2018, President Trump tore up the JCPOA. He had nothing but contempt for the JCPOA. He said it was a terrible nuclear agreement, and he was going to put maximum pressure, and I think he meant maximum economic pressure on the Iranians, and he was going to get a better deal. That's what he promised. And over the course of his first term in office, he failed to do that. There was no nuclear agreement with the Iranians. And in fact, both the Americans and the Iranians began to violate the JCPOA. Joe Biden came in. He said he was going to try and reinstitute the JCPOA. He failed. And then, of course, President Trump comes back to office in January of 2025. This is for his second term. And unsurprisingly, one of the first things that he turns to is the Iranian nuclear issue, because Biden didn't fix it. And he had promised when he withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018 that he'd get a better deal. But of course, that didn't happen. So he set out shortly after he comes into the White House in January 2025 for the second time to get a better deal. And he is negotiating, or I should say his administration is negotiating with the Iranians up through June of 2025. And while the negotiations are going on, the Israelis and the Americans attack the Iranians. And this is the famous 12-day war of June 2025. And this war is aimed at Iran's nuclear capabilities. So I think the basic idea here is that we couldn't get an agreement, couldn't get a new JCPOA or anything like that. So what we'll do is we'll bomb Iran's nuclear capabilities. And that's what we did in the 12-day war. Then, if you fast forward up until February 28th, when another war, another Israeli-American war, was launched against Iran, what you see is that in the run-up to that war, this is the February 28th war, just like in the run-up to the June 2025 war, negotiations were ongoing between the Iranians and the Americans about how to solve the nuclear issue. So twice, the Americans and the Israelis attacked Iran when nuclear negotiations were taking place. Anyway, the war obviously broke out on February 28th. And this raised a whole host of new issues, many of which I'll talk about as we go along here. Because once the war breaks out, the nuclear issue is not the only major issue on the table. For example, there's the whole question of who controls the Strait of Hormuz. And then there are a whole host of economic issues that get raised as well. So it's no longer just the nuclear issue that's on the table after February 28th. Anyway, there's a bombing campaign for 40 days, and that ends on April 8th. And you have a ceasefire, and negotiations actually start between the Iranians and the Americans. This is when J.D. Vance goes to Islamabad and meets with the Iranian negotiators. So this is the first opportunity that we have, the first major opportunity that we have after the start of the war to negotiate a deal with the Iranians to hopefully settle the nuclear issue as well as the other issues that are now on the table. But those negotiations go nowhere. The second big opportunity we have to negotiate a deal, and in a way we do negotiate a deal, is the memorandum of understanding that is signed by President Trump and his Iranian counterpart on June 17th of this year. That's June 17th of 2026. So this is the first evidence of a concrete agreement between the Iranians on one side and the Americans on the other. And it deals with almost all the issues that are on the table. But of course, President Trump walks away from that deal. It effectively falls apart. And we're now at a point where the Iranians, as of Saturday, August 8th, have put a new proposal on the table that in effect builds on the memorandum of understanding, but from an American point of view is much worse. So what I want to do here is focus on the memorandum of understanding and the deal that Trump effectively walked away from on June 17th and show you how much worse the 8 August proposal, the new proposal that the Iranians have put on the table, is for the United States. And one of the key points that I'm going to make as we go along here is that we've actually reached the point where it appears that the nuclear issue, which was once of paramount importance, has basically disappeared from the negotiations, or it has been minimized to a point that is really quite shocking. But let me deal with that later and start by first just talking about all of the issues that I think exist between the Iranians on one side and the Americans on the other side. And I think there are basically 11 issues. And then let me, after laying out those 11 issues that are on the table, explain to you how the memorandum of understanding dealt with those issues, and then switch gears and talk about how Iran's 8 August proposal deals with those issues. And I think you'll see that the Iranians are really driving a hard bargain. It is going to be very difficult for President Trump to accept. But anyway, before we get there, what are the key issues here? Remember, I said there are 11 issues. The first issue is just opening the Strait of Hormuz. And as I said earlier on, this is what President Trump really wants to do. He wants to open the strait. And when you talk about opening the Strait of Hormuz, you're basically talking about doing away with Iran's blockade of the strait, as well as the United States' blockade of the strait. So you have to put an end to these two blockades, and then you have to allow traffic to go into and out of the Strait of Hormuz. So that's the number one issue, just opening the strait. The number two issue is lifting oil sanctions on Iran. Now be careful here. You want to note that I'm not talking about lifting all sanctions on Iran. There are many sanctions on Iran. What we're talking about here is lifting the oil sanctions, which would allow the Iranians to sell their oil on open markets, open global markets. So that's the second issue. The third issue is the ceasefire. And I divide the ceasefire into two different issues. First is the ceasefire involving Israel, the United States, and Iran, the three big players in this conflict. So there's a ceasefire involving them, in my opinion. And then there's a ceasefire that deals with Lebanon, the Houthis, Hamas, this is Gaza, and now Iraq. Right? So you want to understand that when we talk about the ceasefire, I'm discriminating between a ceasefire that involves the United States, Iran, and Israel on one hand. That's my issue number 3. And issue number 4 is a ceasefire that involves those 4 different conflicts, or 1 or 2 of those 4 different smaller conflicts. Again, Gaza, Lebanon, where Hezbollah is located, Yemen with the Houthis, and the Iranian allied militias in Iraq. Okay, so that's the 4th big issue. Then there's the 5th big issue, which is who controls the Strait of Hormuz. Remember, the first issue was just opening up the Strait of Hormuz. The 5th issue is who controls it. The 6th issue related to that is whether or not the Iranians can collect tolls, or what are sometimes called fees. The Iranians are likely to say, we're not going to collect tolls, we're going to collect fees, but it's the same thing for all intents and purposes. So that is the 6th issue. The 7th issue is the U.S. military presence in the region. And here we're talking mainly about the Persian Gulf. Is the United States going to be allowed to keep its military bases, its force structure in the Persian Gulf? And as everybody knows, before February 28th, we had a robust force structure, a robust set of bases in the region. And the issue here, issue number 7, is what's going to happen to the American military presence. Then we come to issues 8, 9, and 10, which are the big 3 economic issues, and all very important. The 8th issue deals with sanctions. And this is where we're talking about all sanctions, lifting sanctions on Iran, period. Remember earlier on when I talked about the 2nd issue, that had to do with just lifting the oil sanctions. Here, with issue number 8, we're talking about lifting all sanctions. Issue number 9 is unfreezing Iranian assets. $100+ billion of Iranian assets are frozen outside of Iran, and the Iranians obviously want those frozen assets unfrozen. Okay, so that's the 9th issue. And the 10th issue is paying reparations. And the number that's usually thrown around is $300 billion. The idea is that someone, who knows for sure which countries would be involved here, but the Iranians will get roughly $300 billion in reparations if this is ever agreed to. But this is the 10th issue. And again, I want to be very clear here. The 8th, 9th, and 10th issues are what I call like the big 3 economic issues. And that's, reparations, frozen assets, and sanctions, all sanctions, okay? Then there's the 11th issue. And I don't want to argue that this is the least important issue, but the 11th issue is the nuclear issue. And here we're talking about the question of nuclear enrichment. That's the issue. And when we talk about nuclear enrichment, you want to remember there are 2 dimensions to that. One is, are the Iranians going to be allowed to have a nuclear enrichment capability? That's one issue. And then number 2 is what's going to be done with all that enriched uranium that the Iranians have. You want to remember they have a great deal of uranium that's enriched up to 60%. And it's quite easy to take uranium that's enriched up to 60% and enrich it up to 90%, which is weapons grade material. So again, when we talk about the nuclear issue, question number 1 is, can they keep their nuclear enrichment capability? And number 2 is, what do you do with all that enriched uranium? Okay, so those are the big 11 issues. And you can see just how complicated all of this is when you take into account those 11 issues. Now, what I want to do is I want to talk about my understanding of how the Memorandum of Understanding of 17 June dealt with all those issues. And then I want to talk about how the Iranians' 8 August proposal deals with those issues and look at the difference in terms of what's happening here. Okay, let's go to the 17 June Memorandum of Understanding. Up front, there were 4 issues that were basically settled. And once those 4 issues were settled, the negotiations would set in, and then you would deal through negotiations with all these other issues.